The courtroom was alive with chatter, the kind of low murmur that fills a space when people are waiting for something big to happen. It wasn't the most exciting case, just a disagreement over where one property ended and another began, but it had drawn attention because of who was involved. Karoline Leavitt, a well-known journalist in the community, was at the center of it all. She had been vocal about how her neighbor's aggressive legal tactics felt unfair. Sitting next to her was her husband Daniel, a man who preferred staying out of the spotlight. He looked calm, almost too calm, dressed in a simple suit that didn't scream lawyer or genius. No one paid much attention to him as they settled into their seats. Judge Richard Holloway walked in, his presence commanding enough to silence the room instantly. He had a reputation for being sharp-tongued and sometimes a little condescending. As he took his seat, his eyes scanned the room, lingering briefly on Daniel. There was something about the way Daniel sat there so quietly, almost like he didn't want to be noticed. The judge probably thought he was just another bystander dragged into a legal mess by his more outspoken wife. The proceedings began with the usual formalities. The judge outlined what would happen during the hearing, making sure everyone understood the rules. Then came the introductions. Karoline stood up first, introducing herself with confidence. She spoke clearly, her voice steady as she explained her side of the story. When it was time to introduce Daniel, she turned toward him with a warm smile. "And this is my husband, Daniel," she said proudly. Daniel gave a polite nod but stayed seated, which seemed to irritate Judge Holloway. "Mr. Leavitt," the judge said dryly, leaning forward slightly, "do you not think it appropriate to stand when being introduced?" The room went quiet, everyone curious to see how Daniel would respond. Without missing a beat, he replied, smoothly, "Your Honor, I assumed standing was reserved for those whose presence might actually sway the court. If my role today requires more formality, I am happy to oblige." A ripple of surprise moved through the gallery. Even Karoline glanced at him, a mix of amusement and pride flickering across her face. Judge Holloway raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Very clever, Mr. Leavitt," he remarked sarcastically. "Let's see if your words hold up under scrutiny." For now, Daniel remained seated, his expression unreadable. But those few seconds had already planted a seed of curiosity in the minds of everyone watching. Who exactly was this man? Was he just trying to make a point, or was there more to him than met the eye? As the hearing moved forward, the opposing counsel started laying out their argument. They spoke in long, complicated sentences filled with legal jargon, clearly aiming to confuse rather than clarify. The judge listened intently, occasionally nodding or jotting down notes. When it was time for Karoline's side to present, everyone expected her to take charge. After all, she was the outspoken one, the public figure, but instead she gestured toward Daniel. "My husband will handle this part," she said confidently. There were murmurs in the gallery as Daniel stood up. He adjusted his tie and took a deep breath before beginning. His voice was calm and measured, breaking down complex ideas into simpler terms that even someone unfamiliar with the law could understand. People leaned forward in their seats, intrigued by how easily he seemed to navigate the tangled web of statutes and precedents. Judge Holloway watched closely, his skepticism still evident. "Impressive recitation, Mr. Leavitt," he commented, after Daniel finished explaining a particularly tricky legal principle. "But can you apply these theories effectively, or are you just regurgitating textbooks?" Daniel didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled faintly. "Your Honor, allow me to demonstrate." With that, he pulled out a series of documents and diagrams, laying them out methodically. Each piece of evidence he presented tied directly to the points he had made earlier, leaving no room for doubt. Opposing counsel started looking uneasy, shifting uncomfortably in their seat. Even Judge Holloway couldn't hide his surprise as Daniel continued to connect the dots with precision. By the end of the morning session, the mood in the courtroom had shifted noticeably. Where there had once been skepticism, there was now growing respect, for Daniel, at least. Opposing counsel struggled to keep up, stumbling over objections and misquoting laws in their desperation to counter Daniel's arguments. Karoline sat quietly beside him, her pride evident in the small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Even Judge Holloway seemed intrigued, though he tried to maintain his stern demeanor. At one point, he leaned back in his chair, studying Daniel with a mix of curiosity and admiration. It was clear that this man wasn't just winging it. He knew exactly what he was doing. And as the day wore on, it became increasingly obvious that Daniel's quiet confidence wasn't misplaced. It was earned. As the afternoon session began, the energy in the courtroom was electric. People who had been casually observing earlier were now fully invested, whispering to each other about Daniel's unexpected brilliance. Opposing counsel, on the other hand, looked rattled. Their earlier confidence had faded, replaced by a growing sense of desperation. They tried to regain control by launching into another lengthy argument, but it was clear they were grasping at straws. The more they spoke, the more their words felt hollow, like they were trying to cover up cracks in their case with layers of unnecessary complexity. Daniel sat quietly through their presentation, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt or roll his eyes, even though it was obvious he could have dismantled their points piece by piece right then and there. Instead, he waited patiently, letting them dig themselves deeper. When it was finally his turn to respond, he stood slowly, as if savoring the moment. He glanced at Karoline briefly, sharing a small, almost imperceptible smile before turning his attention to the judge. "Your Honor," Daniel began, his voice calm but firm. "Let me clarify a few things." What followed was nothing short of masterful. He broke down the opposing counsel's arguments one by one, exposing inconsistencies and logical flaws with surgical precision. Each point he made was backed by solid evidence, documents, maps, and even past court rulings that directly contradicted what the other side was claiming. It wasn't just about proving them wrong. It was about showing how flimsy their entire case really was. Judge Holloway listened intently, his pen moving rapidly across his notepad. For someone who had started the day mocking Daniel, he now seemed genuinely impressed. At one point he interrupted Daniel, not to challenge him but to ask for clarification on a particularly nuanced legal principle. Daniel handled the question effortlessly, explaining it in a way that was both thorough and easy to follow. Even the stenographer paused mid-typing, glancing up in admiration. Opposing counsel tried to object, their voice rising in frustration. "Your Honor, this is all speculative. He's cherry-picking facts to suit his narrative." But their protest fell flat. Judge Holloway waved them off dismissively. "Counselor, if your client's case were as strong as you claim, Mr. Leavitt wouldn't be able to dismantle it so easily. Proceed." The tension in the room was thick, but Daniel remained unfazed. He continued his methodical takedown, never raising his voice or losing his composure. By the time he finished, the opposing lawyer looked defeated, slumping back into their chair like a balloon that had been popped. The gallery erupted into murmurs again, this time filled with awe rather than skepticism. People leaned over to whisper to their neighbors, shaking their heads in disbelief at what they'd just witnessed. Karoline couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. She had always known Daniel was smart, brilliant even, but seeing him in action like this was something else entirely. There was no arrogance in his delivery, no attempt to show off. He simply presented the truth in a way that was impossible to ignore. As he returned to his seat, she reached out and gave his hand a quick squeeze, her way of saying, "I told you you're amazing." With the bulk of the arguments out of the way, it was time for closing statements. Opposing counsel went first, their voice shaky and uncertain. They stumbled over their words, repeating themselves and making weak appeals to emotion. It was clear they were running out of options, their earlier bravado completely gone. When they finally sat down, there was an awkward silence in the room. Even Judge Holloway looked unimpressed, tapping his pen against the desk as if urging them to do better. Then it was Daniel's turn. He stood once more, taking a moment to gather his thoughts before speaking. "Your Honor," he began, his tone respectful but authoritative. "This case isn't just about property lines or technicalities. It's about fairness. about ensuring that the law serves its purpose, to protect people from injustice, not to complicate their lives unnecessarily. He went on to summarize everything that had been discussed, tying it all together in a way that felt natural and convincing. His closing statement wasn't flashy or dramatic. It was grounded and sincere, focusing on the core principles of justice and honesty. When he finished, the room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Even Judge Holloway, who prided himself on maintaining a stoic demeanor, looked momentarily speechless. After a brief pause, the judge cleared his throat and addressed the court. "Mr. Leavitt," he said, his tone notably softer than before, "I must admit I underestimated you. Your grasp of the law and your ability to apply it effectively is remarkable. This court owes you its gratitude for bringing clarity to what could have been a very muddled situation." With that, Judge Holloway delivered his verdict, in favor of Karoline and Daniel. The decision was met with nods of approval from the gallery, while opposing counsel sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. As the gavel struck, signaling the end of the trial, the room erupted into applause. Reporters rushed to gather their notes, eager to capture every detail of the day's events. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed as Karoline and Daniel emerged hand in hand. Reporters swarmed them, shouting questions and holding microphones toward their faces. "How does it feel to win?" one asked. "What's your secret to such a strong defense?" another chimed in. Karoline smiled graciously, letting Daniel take the lead. "I'm just glad justice prevailed," he said humbly, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "The law exists to serve everyone fairly, and today proved that when we focus on the truth, good things happen." Karoline added, "Today reminded us that intelligence and integrity still matter. We're grateful for the outcome, and hopeful that others will see this as an example of what can happen when people stand up for what's right." As they walked away from the crowd, Daniel turned to Karoline with a playful grin. "So, do you think I did okay?" he teased. She laughed, giving his arm a gentle nudge. "Okay? You were incredible. Next time, maybe I'll let you handle everything from the start." They climbed into their car, leaving behind the noise of reporters and onlookers. As they drove home, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. For Daniel, it was a reminder that true genius lies not in seeking recognition, but in using one's gifts to make a difference. And for Karoline, it reinforced her belief in standing by the person she loved most, the quiet hero who had always been her rock. The car ride home was quieter than usual, but the silence between Karoline and Daniel wasn't uncomfortable. It was reflective. Both of them were processing the whirlwind of events that had unfolded in the courtroom. For Karoline, it felt surreal to see her husband step into the spotlight so effortlessly. She'd always known he had a sharp mind, but watching him dismantle complex legal arguments with such ease had been nothing short of awe-inspiring. Daniel, on the other hand, seemed almost unfazed by the attention. He drove calmly, one hand resting lightly on the steering wheel while the other occasionally tapped against his knee, a nervous habit he rarely showed. "You're awfully quiet," Karoline said finally, breaking the silence. "What's going through your head?" He glanced at her briefly before returning his focus to the road. "Honestly, I'm just glad it's over. That wasn't exactly how I planned to spend my week." Karoline chuckled softly. "Well, you handled it better than anyone could have expected. Did you see the look on the judge's face when you started citing those precedents? Priceless." Daniel smirked, shaking his head slightly. "I think shocked might be a better word." Judge Holloway didn't seem too thrilled about being proven wrong. "Who would be?" Karoline shot back playfully. "But seriously, Dan, what you did today, it wasn't just impressive, it was inspiring. People don't realize how much work goes into preparing for something like this." Daniel shrugged modestly, though there was a hint of pride in his voice. "It's not rocket science. Just research and knowing where to look. Anyone can do it if they put in the effort." Karoline raised an eyebrow skeptically. "Oh, sure. Because everyone has access to decades' worth of case law memorized in their brain. Please give yourself some credit." They shared a laugh, the kind of light-hearted moment that came naturally after years of marriage. But beneath the humor, there was an unspoken understanding. Daniel's performance in court hadn't just won them the case. It had reminded them both of the importance of standing up for what's right, even when it feels daunting. Later, that evening, as they sat together on the couch with cups of tea in hand, the conversation turned more serious. The adrenaline from earlier had worn off, leaving room for reflection. Karoline leaned back against the cushions, studying Daniel thoughtfully. "Do you ever regret not pursuing law full-time?" she asked suddenly. The question caught him off guard. He hesitated for a moment, stirring his tea absent-mindedly. "Sometimes," he admitted. "But then I remember why I chose the path I did. Law isn't just about winning cases or impressing judges. It's about helping people navigate situations they can't handle alone. And honestly, I've found ways to do that without stepping foot in a courtroom every day." Karoline nodded, slowly, her expression softening. "Still, it must feel good to know you can hold your own when it matters. Today proved that." "It does," Daniel agreed quietly. "But it also reminds me how intimidating the system can be for people who don't understand it. We got lucky. I knew enough to fight back. What about those who don't?" His words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Karoline reached over and placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "Maybe this is your chance to change that. You've got a gift, Dan. Why not use it to help others?" For a moment, neither of them spoke. The idea lingered between them, sparking possibilities neither had fully considered before. Daniel had always been content staying behind the scenes, supporting Karoline in her career while keeping his own talents under wraps. But maybe, just maybe, today had planted the seed for something bigger. The next morning, the story of their courtroom victory dominated local news headlines. Reporters had wasted no time turning the trial into a human interest piece, highlighting Daniel's unexpected brilliance and Judge Holloway's rare admission of being wrong. Neighbors and acquaintances flooded Karoline's phone with messages, congratulating her and expressing admiration for Daniel's composure and skill. At first, Daniel felt uneasy about the sudden attention. He wasn't used to being in the limelight and preferred solving problems quietly, rather than basking in praise. But as the day went on, something shifted. A call came in from an old friend who ran a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing free legal aid to low-income families. "Hey, I saw the news," the friend said enthusiastically. "Listen, we could really use someone like you on our team. People need advocates who can break down complicated stuff into plain language. Interested?" Daniel hesitated, glancing at Karoline, who was listening intently from across the room. She gave him an encouraging nod, her eyes bright with excitement. "Let me think about it," he replied cautiously, though deep down he already knew the answer. By the end of the week, Daniel had agreed to volunteer a few hours each month at the nonprofit. It wasn't a drastic change, far from it, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter. For the first time in years, he felt a renewed sense of purpose, a reminder that his skills could make a difference beyond the confines of a single courtroom. As weeks turned into months, Daniel settled into his new role with surprising ease. He discovered a passion for teaching others how to navigate the legal system, empowering them to advocate for themselves. Meanwhile, Karoline continued to shine in her journalism career, often drawing inspiration from Daniel's experiences to shed light on issues affecting everyday people. Their lives weren't perfect. They still faced challenges, disagreements, and moments of doubt, but they tackled everything together, leaning on each other's strengths. And while Daniel may never have sought fame or recognition, he couldn't deny the satisfaction of knowing he was making a real impact. One evening, as they sat outside watching the sunset, Karoline turned to him with a smile. "You know," she said softly, "you're kind of my hero." Daniel laughed, brushing off the compliment as usual. "Yeah, right. Your hero is the guy who brings you coffee every morning." She rolled her eyes but leaned closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "No, seriously. You remind me every day that intelligence and kindness go hand in hand. Not everyone gets to say that about their partner." For once, Daniel didn't argue. Instead, he wrapped an arm around her, letting the warmth of the moment sink in. Life had thrown its share of curveballs their way, but together, they'd managed to turn even the most unexpected challenges into opportunities for growth. And as the sky painted itself in hues of orange and pink, they sat quietly, grateful for the journey and each other. Daniel's decision to volunteer at the nonprofit marked a turning point, not just for him but for the entire organization. At first, he wasn't sure what to expect. The nonprofit operated out of a small office tucked away in a quiet neighborhood, its walls lined with bookshelves filled with legal texts and folders bursting with case files. It was nothing like the polished courtrooms or high-stakes hearings he'd seen on TV. This was grassroots work, raw and unfiltered, dealing with people whose lives were hanging by a thread because of legal issues they couldn't afford to resolve. His first day started with a meeting led by his friend who ran the place. They sat around a worn wooden table, sipping coffee from mismatched mugs while going over the week's cases. Daniel listened intently as each story unfolded. Tenants fighting eviction notices, single parents trying to navigate custody battles, immigrants desperate to stay in the country they now called home. These weren't abstract scenarios. These were real people with real fears, hopes, and dreams. As the meeting wrapped up, Daniel's friend turned to him. "So, you ready to dive in? I've got someone waiting for your help right now." Daniel nodded, though his stomach churned slightly. He had spent years avoiding the spotlight, preferring to solve problems quietly behind closed doors. But this was different. This wasn't about impressing judges or winning arguments. It was about giving someone a fighting chance when the odds were stacked against them. The client waiting for him was a young woman named Maria. She looked nervous, her hands clutching a folder tightly as if it held all her answers. When Daniel introduced himself, she gave him a tentative smile. "I'm not sure how much you can do," she admitted softly. "But thank you for trying." Her case was straightforward yet heartbreaking. She worked 2 jobs to support her son but faced eviction after her landlord raised the rent beyond what she could afford. She didn't know where else to turn. As she explained her situation, Daniel felt a pang of frustration, not at her, but at the system that made life so difficult for people like her. He spent the next hour walking her through her rights, explaining tenant protections, and helping her draft a letter to the landlord. By the end of their session, Maria looked visibly relieved. "I didn't know any of this," she said, her voice steadier now. "Thank you. Really. It was a small victory, but it meant everything to her, and to Daniel. For the first time in years, he felt like he was using his knowledge for something meaningful. It wasn't about proving himself or earning accolades. It was about making a difference one person at a time. Word spread quickly among the nonprofit's clients that there was a new volunteer who could explain complicated legal jargon in simple terms. Before long, Daniel's schedule filled up, and he found himself juggling multiple cases. Some were easy fixes, while others required hours of research and preparation. But no matter how challenging a case became, Daniel approached it with patience and determination. Karoline noticed the change in him almost immediately. Gone was the quiet reserve that sometimes bordered on self-doubt. In its place was a renewed sense of confidence, not arrogance, but the kind that comes from knowing you're doing something worthwhile. One evening, as they cooked dinner together, she teased him gently. "You're becoming quite the celebrity around here. People are talking about you like you're some kind of superhero." Daniel laughed, flipping a pancake on the stove. "Hardly. I'm just helping where I can. Besides, it's not about me, it's about them, the people who need someone in their corner." Karoline smiled, leaning against the counter. "Still, it's nice to see you stepping into your own. You've always been amazing, but now you're letting other people see it too." Her words lingered in his mind long after dinner was over. He hadn't set out to be anyone's hero, but maybe being a hero didn't mean wearing a cape or saving the world in one grand gesture. Maybe it meant showing up day after day and doing the hard work that most people overlooked. One particular case stood out during those early months, a man named Tom who was battling an unfair dismissal from his job. Tom had been with the company for over a decade, working tirelessly to provide for his family. When he was let go without explanation, it left him reeling. He came to the nonprofit unsure of whether he even had a case. convinced that the system wouldn't side with someone like him. Daniel took on the challenge with his usual thoroughness. He pored over employment laws, reviewed Tom's contract, and helped him gather evidence to support his claim. It wasn't easy. There were setbacks and moments of doubt, but Daniel refused to give up. He reminded Tom that justice wasn't always immediate, but it was worth fighting for. When the case finally went before a labor tribunal, Daniel accompanied Tom to offer moral support. Watching Tom speak passionately about his years of dedication to the company, Daniel felt a lump form in his throat. This wasn't just about getting a paycheck. It was about dignity, respect, and fairness. To everyone's relief, the tribunal ruled in Tom's favor, ordering the company to reinstate him with back pay. As they left the building, Tom turned to Daniel, tears glistening in his eyes. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You gave me my life back." Daniel shook his head, uncomfortable with the praise. "You did the hard part, I just pointed you in the right direction." But deep down, he knew the truth. Sometimes pointing someone in the right direction was enough to change their entire trajectory. Back at home, Karoline celebrated Daniel's growing impact in her own way. She started writing articles highlighting the importance of accessible legal aid, weaving personal stories from the nonprofit into her pieces. Her readers responded enthusiastically, many reaching out to ask how they could contribute. Together, she and Daniel began brainstorming ways to expand the nonprofit's reach, dreaming of a future where no one would have to face the legal system alone. Their partnership, both in life and in purpose, grew stronger with each passing day. While Daniel focused on empowering individuals, Karoline used her platform to shine a light on systemic issues. They complemented each other perfectly, balancing action with awareness. One night, as they lay in bed talking about their plans for the future, Karoline turned to Daniel with a mischievous grin. "You know, we make a pretty good team." He chuckled, pulling her closer. "Yeah, we do. Who would have thought the quiet guy could hold his own?" She kissed his cheek lightly. Not so quiet anymore. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel didn't feel the need to hide. He realized that true strength wasn't about standing silently in the background. It was about stepping forward when it mattered most, even if it scared you. As the months rolled on, Daniel's role at the nonprofit grew beyond what anyone had anticipated. What started as a few hours of volunteering each week turned into something much bigger. The organization began relying on him not just for legal advice but also for training others to handle simpler cases. It was clear that his ability to break down complex ideas into digestible pieces was invaluable, not only for clients but also for the volunteers who worked alongside him. One afternoon, during a team meeting, his friend who ran the nonprofit stood up and cleared his throat. "All right, everyone, listen up," he said with a grin. "We've been talking about expanding our outreach program, and I think it's time we bring Daniel in full-time. He's already doing most of the heavy lifting anyway." The room erupted into applause, catching Daniel off guard. He sat there blinking, unsure how to respond. Full-time? That wasn't something he'd ever considered. Sure, he loved the work, but committing fully meant stepping away from the quiet life he and Karoline had built together. Still, as he looked around the room at the faces of his colleagues, each one dedicated to helping people navigate some of the toughest moments of their lives, he felt a pull he couldn't ignore. "I'll think about it," he said finally, earning laughter from the group. They knew better than to push him too hard. Daniel had always been someone who needed time to weigh his options carefully. That evening, over dinner, Karoline brought up the offer. She could tell Daniel was mulling it over. His brow furrowed slightly as he picked at his food. "So," she said casually, "what do you think?" He sighed, setting down his fork. "I don't know. It's a big step. I mean, this isn't exactly what I imagined doing with my life." Karoline tilted her head thoughtfully. "But doesn't it feel right? You've always had this gift for making things clearer for people. Why not use it where it's needed most?" Daniel nodded slowly, though doubt still lingered in his eyes. "It's not just about me. What about us? If I take this on full-time, things will change." She reached across the table, placing her hand over his. Change isn't always bad. Besides, we'll figure it out together. You're happiest when you're helping people. That's one thing I've always admired about you. Her words stayed with him long after they finished eating. Change was scary, sure, but maybe it was also necessary. After all, hadn't their entire journey so far been about embracing unexpected opportunities? A week later, Daniel accepted the offer. His first official day as a full-time volunteer coordinator felt surreal. Instead of sitting alone in an office or researching cases by himself, he now led workshops, mentored new volunteers, and collaborated with local lawyers willing to offer pro bono services. The workload was demanding, but it was also deeply fulfilling. Each success story, from families keeping their homes to workers reclaiming stolen wages, felt like a small victory against a system that often seemed rigged against the vulnerable. One of the biggest changes came when the nonprofit decided to host a community fair aimed at educating people about their rights. Daniel played a key role in organizing the event, working tirelessly to ensure everything ran smoothly. On the day of the fair, booths lined the park offering information on housing laws, employment rights, immigration support, and more. Volunteers handed out flyers while kids played nearby, their laughter filling the air. Karoline attended too, snapping photos for an article she planned to write. As she watched Daniel move between booths, answering questions and chatting warmly with attendees, she couldn't help but smile. He looked alive in a way she hadn't seen before, confident, engaged, and completely at ease. At one point, a young man approached Daniel hesitantly. "Excuse me," he said, clutching a crumpled piece of paper. "Can you help me understand this letter? My landlord sent it and I'm not sure what it means." Daniel took the letter, scanning it quickly. "Of course," he replied kindly. "Let's sit down and go through it together." They found a quiet spot under a tree, and Daniel patiently explained the document, highlighting key points and advising the man on his next steps. By the time they finished, the young man looked relieved. "Thank you," he said sincerely. "I didn't know where else to turn." Daniel smiled. "You're welcome. And remember, you're not alone. There are people here who want to help." The fair was a resounding success, drawing attention from local media outlets and inspiring similar events in neighboring towns. For Daniel, it reinforced the importance of accessibility. The law wasn't supposed to be a weapon wielded by those in power. It was meant to protect everyone equally. Yet for far too many, navigating the legal system felt impossible without guidance. Karoline's article about the fair went viral, sparking conversations online about the need for affordable legal resources. Readers flooded her inbox with messages, sharing their own struggles and thanking her for shedding light on such a critical issue. Inspired by the response, she and Daniel began brainstorming ways to amplify their efforts even further. "We should start a podcast," Karoline suggested. "One evening. Something that breaks down legal concepts in plain language. People trust you, they'll listen." Daniel laughed nervously. "A podcast? Me? I'm not exactly a natural entertainer." "You don't have to be," she countered. "Just be yourself. That's what people connect with." After some convincing, Daniel agreed to give it a try. They named it Plain Talk Law for Everyone and launched it quietly, unsure how it would be received. To their surprise, the first episode, a discussion about tenant rights, quickly gained traction. Listeners praised Daniel's calm demeanor and ability to explain complicated topics in a way that made sense. Soon, the podcast became another tool in their mission to make the law more accessible. Guests joined them to talk about everything from workplace discrimination to family law, and listener feedback poured in daily. One email stood out in particular. "Your show saved me thousands in legal fees. Thank you for explaining things I never understood before." Reading the message aloud, Daniel shook his head in disbelief. "I can't believe this is happening," he admitted. "It's crazy." "It's amazing," Karoline corrected him, "and it's because you refuse to give up." Their shared passion brought them closer than ever. While Daniel focused on empowering individuals through the nonprofit and the podcast, Karoline continued using her platform to advocate for systemic change. Together, they formed a partnership rooted in mutual respect and admiration. Neither sought fame or recognition. They simply wanted to leave the world a little better than they'd found it. One night, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the summer air, Daniel turned to Karoline with a thoughtful expression. "Do you ever wonder if we're doing enough?" She smiled softly, leaning her head on his shoulder. "Probably not. But does anyone ever feel like they're doing enough? All we can do is keep trying." He nodded, wrapping an arm around her. "Yeah. And as long as we're doing it together, I think we'll be okay." In that moment, surrounded by the quiet hum of nature and the warmth of each other's presence, they both knew they were exactly where they were meant to be. Life wasn't perfect, it rarely was, but it was meaningful. And sometimes, that was enough. As the podcast gained momentum, Daniel and Karoline found themselves busier than ever. What had started as a small project to explain legal concepts in simple terms quickly grew into something much bigger. People weren't just tuning in for advice, they were sharing their own stories, asking questions, and building a community around the idea that understanding the law didn't have to be intimidating. The feedback they received was overwhelming, but it also came with its own set of challenges. One evening, after recording an episode on navigating divorce proceedings, Daniel leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "I didn't realize how personal this would get," he admitted. "Every email, every comment, it's like we've opened a floodgate." Karoline nodded, scrolling through the latest batch of messages. "That's because people trust you. They see you as someone who actually cares, not just another expert talking down to them." Daniel sighed, glancing at the stack of letters and emails waiting for responses. "I care, sure, but I'm only one person. How do we keep up with all of this?" She smiled reassuringly, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We don't have to do it alone. Remember when you first started volunteering? You trained others to help out. Maybe it's time to bring more voices into the mix." Her suggestion sparked an idea. Over the next few weeks, they began inviting listeners to share their experiences during live Q&A sessions. These segments became some of the most popular parts of the podcast, offering real-world perspectives alongside Daniel's expertise. One listener, a single mother who had successfully fought for custody of her children, joined them to talk about her journey. Her story resonated deeply with others going through similar struggles, reminding everyone that they weren't alone. The nonprofit continued to thrive as well, thanks in large part to the attention brought by the podcast. Donations poured in, allowing them to expand their services and hire additional staff. For Daniel, this meant juggling even more responsibilities, but it also gave him the chance to mentor new volunteers, passing on the skills he'd honed over the years. One afternoon, as he sat in his office reviewing case files, a young woman named Lisa knocked on the doorframe. She had recently joined the team as an intern and looked nervous, clutching a notebook tightly. "Do you have a minute?" she asked hesitantly. "Of course," Daniel replied, gesturing for her to sit. "What's on your mind?" Lisa hesitated, before speaking. I wanted to say thank you. Your workshops have been so helpful. Before I started here, I didn't think I could make a difference. But now I feel like maybe I can." Daniel smiled warmly, remembering the early days of his own journey. "You absolutely can. It's not about knowing everything. It's about being willing to learn and listen. That's what makes the biggest impact." Her gratitude stayed with him long after their conversation ended. It reminded him why he'd chosen this path in the first place, to empower others, whether directly or indirectly. Meanwhile, Karoline's journalism career reached new heights as she continued writing about social justice issues. Her articles often highlighted stories from the nonprofit, shining a light on individuals whose victories might otherwise go unnoticed. Readers responded enthusiastically, many inspired to take action themselves. One piece titled "The Quiet Heroes Among Us" went viral, prompting hundreds of people to reach out and ask how they could contribute. Inspired by the response, Karoline organized a fundraising gala to support the nonprofit's expansion efforts. The event was held at a local community center, decorated with strings of fairy lights and tables filled with homemade dishes donated by supporters. Daniel stood nervously near the entrance, unsure what to expect, while Karoline mingled confidently among the guests. When it came time for speeches, Karoline took the stage, her voice steady and heartfelt. "Tonight is about celebrating the power of community," she began. "It's about recognizing that change doesn't happen because of one person. It happens because of all of us working together." She then introduced Daniel, who stepped up reluctantly but was met with thunderous applause. As he spoke about the importance of accessible legal aid, his words carried weight, not because of any grand gestures, but because of their sincerity. By the end of the night, the fundraiser had exceeded its goal, raising enough money to open a second location in a neighboring town. Despite their growing success, Daniel and Karoline never lost sight of what mattered most: the people they served. Whether it was helping a tenant fight an unfair eviction notice or guiding a worker through a wage dispute, their focus remained steadfast. Each victory, no matter how small, reinforced their belief that even the smallest actions could create ripples of change. One particularly challenging case involved a retired teacher named Margaret, who was facing foreclosure on her home due to predatory lending practices. Her story tugged at Daniel's heartstrings. She had lived in the house for decades, raising her family there and pouring her life savings into keeping it afloat. When she came to the nonprofit, she was on the verge of giving up. Daniel spent countless hours researching her situation, reaching out to housing advocates and drafting appeals. It was grueling work, but he refused to let Margaret lose hope. "This isn't just about a house," he told her gently. "It's about dignity, about standing up and saying, 'Enough.'" When the bank finally agreed to renegotiate the loan terms, Margaret broke down in tears. "I don't know how to thank you," she whispered, clutching Daniel's hand. "You saved my home and my life." He shook his head, uncomfortable with the praise. "You did the hard part. I just pointed you in the right direction." But deep down, he knew the truth. Sometimes pointing someone in the right direction was enough to change everything. As the year drew to a close, Daniel and Karoline took a moment to reflect on how far they'd come. Their partnership, both in life and in purpose, had grown, stronger with each challenge they faced. Together they had built something remarkable, a network of support for those who needed it most. One snowy December evening, as they sat by the fire sipping hot cocoa, Karoline turned to Daniel with a mischievous grin. "So, what's next for us, Mr. Legal Genius?" He laughed, shaking his head. "Honestly, I have no idea. But whatever it is, I'm glad we're doing it together." She leaned over, resting her head on his shoulder. "Me too. Here's to making more waves." Outside, snowflakes drifted lazily to the ground, blanketing the world in quiet stillness. Inside, the warmth of their shared mission filled the room, a reminder that even in the darkest times, light could always be found, if you were willing to look for it. The new year brought fresh opportunities and fresh challenges for Daniel and Karoline. Their work had grown beyond anything they could have imagined, but it also came with its share of complications. The nonprofit was busier than ever, fielding calls from people in desperate situations. The podcast continued to gain traction, drawing in listeners from across the country who were hungry for practical advice and real stories. And while their efforts were making a difference, the sheer volume of need sometimes felt overwhelming. One chilly January morning, Daniel arrived at the nonprofit's office early as usual. He liked the quiet before the chaos began, the chance to sip his coffee in peace and mentally prepare for the day ahead. But today, something felt different. As he unlocked the door, he noticed an envelope taped to the glass. Curious, he picked it up and opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. "Thank you for everything you do. You may not realize it, but your work changes lives. Keep going." There was no signature, just those simple words scrawled on plain paper. Daniel stood there. For a moment, the note clutched in his hand, feeling an unexpected lump rise in his throat. He didn't know who had left it or why, but it reminded him of why he kept pushing forward. even on days when the weight of it all threatened to crush him. Karoline, too, was navigating her own challenges. Her journalism career had reached new heights, but the pressure to produce meaningful content was relentless. Late nights spent researching and writing were becoming the norm, leaving her exhausted but fulfilled. Still, she made time to support Daniel however she could, whether by helping draft promotional materials for the nonprofit or brainstorming ideas for the podcast. One evening, as they sat together on the couch reviewing notes for an upcoming episode, Karoline looked over at Daniel thoughtfully. "Do you ever feel like we're biting off more than we can chew?" she asked, her voice tinged with both humor and concern. He chuckled softly, setting aside his pen. "Every single day. But then, I think about what happens if we don't try. Someone has to step up, right?" She nodded, leaning back against the cushions. "Yeah, I guess so. It's just, sometimes I worry we're spreading ourselves too thin." "We are," he admitted honestly. "But isn't that better than doing nothing? Besides, we've got each other. That makes it easier." Her expression softened and she reached out to take his hand. "You're right, we'll figure it out one step at a time." That mindset became their guiding principle as they tackled the hurdles ahead. When funding for the nonprofit hit a snag, they rallied the community, hosting bake sales and crowdfunding campaigns that exceeded their goals. When listener feedback suggested the podcast needed more diverse voices, they reached out to experts in fields they hadn't yet explored, immigration lawyers, disability advocates, even financial advisors, to provide well-rounded perspectives. Each success, no matter how small, fueled their determination to keep going. One particularly memorable win came when a local business owner named Robert contacted them after hearing about their work through the podcast. His employee, a young woman named Emily, had been unfairly dismissed due to pregnancy discrimination. Unsure of where to turn, Robert encouraged her to reach out to the nonprofit. Daniel took on the case, guiding Emily through the process of filing a complaint with the labor board. It wasn't easy. The company fought back aggressively, claiming her termination was unrelated to her pregnancy. But Daniel dug deep, uncovering evidence that proved otherwise. In the end, Emily not only received compensation, but also secured a public apology from the company, a rare victory in cases like hers. When Emily came to thank Daniel in person, tears streaming down her face, he felt a surge of pride, not for himself, but for the system working as it should. "This isn't just my win," he told her gently. "It's yours. You stood up for yourself, and that's what matters most." As spring approached, Daniel and Karoline decided to take a much-needed break. They rented a cabin near a lake, far away from emails, phone calls, and deadlines. For 3 days they hiked, cooked meals together, and watched the sunset reflect off the water. It was a rare moment of stillness in their otherwise hectic lives. On their last night, as they sat outside under a blanket of stars, Karoline turned to Daniel with a thoughtful smile. "Do you remember when you first started volunteering? Did you ever think it would lead to all this?" He shook his head, laughing softly. "Not in a million years. I thought I'd just be helping a few people here and there. Never imagined it would snowball into whatever this is. And are you happy?" She pressed, her tone gentle. He didn't hesitate. "Yeah, I am. Sure, it's messy and exhausting sometimes, but it's worth it. Knowing we're making a difference, even if it's just for one person, that's everything." She leaned her head on his shoulder, gazing up at the sky. "Me too. This life we've built, it's not perfect, but it's ours. And I wouldn't trade it for anything." Back home, they returned to their routines with renewed energy. The nonprofit celebrated its 5th anniversary, marking the occasion with a community event that drew hundreds of attendees. The podcast released its 100th episode, featuring heartfelt messages from listeners whose lives had been impacted by the show. And Daniel and Karoline found themselves reflecting on how far they'd come, not just individually but together. One afternoon, as they walked hand in hand through the park, Daniel stopped suddenly, pulling Karoline close. "You know," he said, his voice soft but earnest, "none of this would have happened without you." You believed in me when I didn't believe in myself." She smiled, her eyes shining. "And you remind me every day why fighting for what's right matters. We make a pretty good team, don't we?" "The best," he agreed, kissing her forehead lightly. As they continued their walk, surrounded by the sounds of laughter and birdsong, they both knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth. There would be setbacks, doubts, and moments of uncertainty. But as long as they faced them side by side, they were ready for whatever came next. Because in the end, it wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about standing up for those who couldn't stand alone and finding joy in the journey along the way.